All right, I think this works. I'm trying this little lapel mic. Oh, hopefully that wasn't too loud. But this preacher mic. So I got this collection of books here. If anyone doesn't own them, I suggest you might get them. They're delicious. George MacDonald. They're a collection of short stories. So in each one is like, this is The Light Princess and other short stories. So there's like multiple ones in here. So I don't know how long it's going to take me to read through one of these. I've read through some of them before, but see, this one has different ones in there. Anyway, this one in particular, The Grey Wolf and Other Stories. The Grey Wolf is a very short story. I'd love to go through it with someone at some point, but I haven't yet. I don't think I understand it well. That's why I kind of want to read it with other people. And I don't know that I understand this one really well either, and I'll probably fumble over it quite a bit because I'm pretty sure it's written in, like, you know, he writes the dialect. There's a bird hanging out on the front of my car. He writes the dialect into like the text and everything. Let me close that. I'm just gonna try. Let's see, what page was it? It's called, the story actually is called, I don't know if I said that. The story is called The Wow o' Riven, but it's come into my mind quite a few times recently, just listening to different conversations of different people I know that get into conversations on the internet here and there, talking about different theological things. And if you can get in debates of who's right or who's wrong, I feel like this story this story probably says a lot of things, so just take it how you will. Hopefully you enjoy it. I think that bird, he's just sticking his butt at me. I think he's getting, don't poop on my car. What are you doing? This little black bird, I think it's, whatever. The Wow o' Riven, The Bell. Elsie Scott had let her work fall on her knees. Am I messing up already? That just sounds weird. Elsie Scott had let her work fall on her knees and her hands on her work, and was looking out of the wide, low window of her room, which was on one of the ground floors of the village street. Through a gap in the household shrubbery of fuchsias, I don't know how to say that, and myrtles filling the windowsill, one passing on the foot pavement might get a momentary glimpse of her pale face, lighted up with two blue eyes, over which some inward trouble had spread a faint gauze-like haziness. But almost before her thoughts had time to wander back to this trouble, a shout of children's voices at the other end of the street reached her ear. She listened a moment. A shadow of displeasure and pain crossed her countenance, and rising hastily, she betook herself to an inner apartment and closed the door behind her. Meantime, the sounds drew nearer, and by an old man whose strange appearance and dress showed that he had little capacity either for good or evil passed the window. His clothes were comfortable enough in quality and condition, for they were the annual gift of a benevolent lady in the neighborhood, but being made to accommodate his taste, both known and traditional, they were somewhat peculiar in cut and adornment. Both coat and trousers were of a dark gray cloth, but the former, which in its shape partook of the military, had a straight collar of yellow and narrow cuffs of the same, while upon both sleeves, about the place where a corporal wears his stripes, was expressed in the same yellow cloth a somewhat singular device. It was as close in imitation of a bell, with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, as the tailor's skill could produce from a single piece of cloth. The origin of the military cut of his coat was well known. His preference for it arose in the time of the wars of the first Napoleon, when the threatened invasion of the country caused the organization of many volunteer regiments. The martial show and exercises captivated the poor man's fancy, and from that time forward nothing pleased his vanity, and consequently conciliated his goodwill more than to style him by his favorite title, the colonel. The colonel, I guess. I'm pretty sure that's, you pronounce that colonel. Oh my gosh. Why do I read these things? I just embarrassed myself. The colonel. But the badge on his arm had a deeper origin, which will be partially manifest in the course of the story. If it if story it can be called. It was indeed the baptism of the fool, the outward and visible sign of his relation to the infinite and unseen. His countenance, however, although the features were not of any peculiarly low or animal type, showed no corresponding sign of the consciousness of such a relation, being as vacant as human countenance could well be. The cause of Elsie's annoyance was that the fool was annoyed. He was followed by a troop of boys who turned his rank into scorn, and assailed him with epithets hateful to him. Although the most harmless of creatures when let alone, he was dangerous when roused, and now he stooped repeatedly to pick up stones and hurl them at his tormentors, who took care, while abusing him, to keep at a considerable distance, lest he should get hold of them. Amidst the sounds of derision that followed him might be heard the words frequently repeated, "Come hame, come hame." But in a few minutes the noise ceased, either from the interference of some friendly inhabitant, or that the boys grew weary and departed in search of other amusement. By and by, Elsie might be seen again at her work in the window, but the cloud over her eyes was deeper, and her whole face more sad. Indeed, so much did the persecution of this poor man affect her, that an onlooker would have been compelled to seek the cause in some yet deeper sympathy than that commonly felt for the oppressed, even by women. And such a sympathy existed, strange as it may seem, between the beautiful girl, for many called her a bonny lassie, and this tatter of humanity. Nothing would have been further from the thoughts of those that knew them than the supposition of any correspondence or connection between them. Yet this sympathy sprang in part from a real similarity in their history and present condition. All the facts that were known about Field Jock's origin were these: that 70 years ago, a man who had gone with his horse and cart some miles from the village to fetch home a load of peat from a desolate moss had heard, while toiling along as rough a road on as lonely a hillside as any in Scotland, the cry of a child, and, searching about, had found the infant, hardly wrapped in rags and unattended, as if the earth herself had just given him birth. That desert moor, wide and dismal, broken and watery, the only bosom for him to lie upon, and the cold, clear night heaven his only covering. The man had brought him home, and the parish had taken parish care of him. Such a good line. The parish had taken parish care of him. He had grown up and proved what he now was, almost an idiot. Many of the townspeople were kind to him, and employed him in fetching water for them from the river or wells in the neighborhood, paying him for his trouble in victuals or whiskey, of which he was very fond. He seldom spoke, and the sentences he could utter were few, yet the tone, even the words of his limited vocabulary, were sufficient to express gratitude and some measure of love toward those who were kind to him, and hatred of those who teased and insulted him. He lived a life without aim, and apparently to no purpose, in this resembling most of his more gifted fellow men, who, with all the tools and materials necessary for building a noble mansion, are yet content with a clay hut. Elsie, on the contrary, had been born in a comfortable farmhouse amidst homeliness and abundance, but at a very early age she had lost both father and mother. Not so early, however, but that she had faint memories of a warm, soft times on her mother's bosom, and of refuge in her mother's arms from the attacks of geese and the pursuit of pigs. Therefore, in after times, when she looked forward to heaven, it was as much a reverting to the old heavenly times of childhood and mother's love, as an anticipation of something yet to be revealed. Indeed, without some such memory, how should we ever picture to ourselves a perfect rest? I'm going to repeat that. I have it highlighted, but I'm going to repeat it again. Therefore, in after times, when she looked forward to heaven, it was as much a reverting to the old heavenly times of childhood and mother's love, as an anticipation of something yet to be revealed. Indeed, without some such memory, how should we ever picture to ourselves a perfect rest? But sometimes it would seem as if the more a heart was made capable of loving, the less it had to love. And poor Elsie, God, that's so good. But sometimes it would seem as if the more a heart was made capable of loving, the less it had to love. And poor Elsie, in passing from a mother's to a brother's guardianship, felt a change of spiritual temperature too keen, He was not a bad man, or incapable of benevolence when touched by the sight of want in anything of which he would himself have felt the privation. But he was so coarsely made that only the purest animal necessities affected him, and a hard word or unfeeling speech could never have reached the quick of his nature through the hide that enclosed it. Elsie, on the contrary, was excessively and painfully sensitive, as if her nature constantly portended an invisible multitude of half-spiritual, half-nervous antennae, which shrank and trembled in every current of air at the bellow of her own temperature. The effect of this upon her behavior was such that she was called odd, and the poor girl felt she was not like other people, yet could not help it. Her brother, too, laughed at her without the slightest idea of the pain he occasioned, or the remotest feeling of curiosity as to what the inward and consistent causes of the outward abnormal condition might be. Tenderness was the divine comforting she needed, and it was altogether absent from her brother's character and behavior. Her neighbors looked on her with some interest, but they rather shunned than courted her acquaintance, especially after the return of certain nervous attacks to which she had been subject in childhood, and which were again brought on by the events I must relate. It is curious how certain diseases repel, by a kind of awe, the sympathies of the neighbors, as if by the fact of being subject to them, the patient were removed into another realm of existence, from which, like the dead with the living, she can hold communion with those around her only partially, and with a mixture of dread pervading the intercourse. Thus some of the deepest, purest wells of spiritual life are, like those in old castles, choked up by the decay of the outer walls. But what tended more than anything, perhaps, to keep up the painful unrest of her soul for the beauty of her character was evident in the fact that the irritation seldom reached her mind. That was all in parentheses. But what tended her more than anything, perhaps, to keep up the painful unrest of her soul was a circumstance at which, in its present connection, some of my readers will smile, and others feel a shudder corresponding in kind to that of Elsie. Her brother was very fond of a rather small but ferocious-looking bulldog, which followed close at his heels wherever he went, without hanging head and slouching gait, never leaping or racing about like other dogs. When in the house, he always lay under his master's chair. He seemed to dislike Elsie, and she felt an unspeakable repugnance to him, though she never mentioned her aversion. Her brother easily saw it by the way in which she avoided the animal, and attributing it entirely to fear, which he indeed had a great share in the matter, he would cruelly aggravate it by telling her stories of the fierce hardihood and relentless persistency of this kind of animal. He dared not yet further increase her terror by offering to set the creature upon her, because it was doubtful whether he might be able to restrain him. But the mental suffering which he occasioned by this heartless conduct, and for which he had no sympathy, was as severe as many bodily sufferings to which he would have been sorry to subject her. Whenever the poor girl happened inadvertently to pass near the dog, which was seldom, a low growl made her aware of his proximity and drove her to a quick retreat. He was, in fact, the animal impersonation of the animal opposition which she had continually to endure. Like chooses like, and the bulldog in her brother made choice of the bulldog out of him for his companion. Yeah, that's rough. Reminds me of something Cal said to me once about horses and dogs, that we almost have a debt to those two creatures. Anyways, like chooses like, and the bulldog in her brother made choice of the bulldog out of him for his companion. So her day was one of shrinking fear and multiform discomfort. But a nature capable of so much distress must of necessity be capable of a corresponding amount of pleasure, and in her case this was manifest in the fact that sleep and the quiet of her own room restored her wonderfully, and she was only let alone. A calm mood, filled with images of pleasure, soon took possession of her mind. Her acquaintance with the fool had commenced some 10 years previous of the time I write. Her acquaintance with the fool had commenced some 10 years previous of the time I write of, when she was quite a little girl and had come from the country with her brother, who, having taken a small farm close to the town, preferred residing in the town to occupying the farmhouse, which was not comfortable. She looked at first with some terror on his uncouth appearance and with much wonderment on his strange dress. This wonder was heightened by a conversation she overheard one day in the street between the fool and a little pale-faced boy who approached him respectively, said, "Weel, Cornell." "Weel, laddie," was his reply. "Fat dis wow say, Cornell." Come hame," answered the colonel, with both accent and quantity heaped on the word hame. What the wow could be, she had no idea. Only as the years passed on, the strange word became in her mind indescribably associated with the strange shape in the yellow cloth on his sleeves. Had she been a native of the town, she would not have failed to know its import. So familiar was every one with it, although it did not belong to the local vocabulary. But, as it was, years passed away before she discovered its meaning, and when, again and again, the fool, attempting to convey his gratitude for some kindness she had shown him, mumbled over the words, "The wow o' Riven, the wow o' Riven," the wonder would return as to what could be the idea associated with the term in the one And when again and again the fool, attempting to convey his gratitude for some kindness she had shown him, mumbled over the words, "The wow o' Riven, the wow o' Riven," the wonder would return as to what could be the idea associated with them in his mind, but she made no advance toward their expectation. That, however, which most attracted her to the old man was his persecution by the children. They were to him what the bulldog was to her, the constant source of irritation and annoyance. They could hardly hurt him, nor did he appear to dread other injury from them than insult, to which, the fool though he was keenly alive. Human gadflies that they were, they sometimes stung him beyond endurance, and he would curse them in the impotence of his anger. Once or twice Elsie had been so far carried beyond her constitutional timidity by sympathy for the distress of her friend that she had gone out and talked to the boys, even scolded them, so that they slunk away ashamed and began to stand as much in dread of her as the clutches of their prey. So she, gentle and timid to excess, acquired among them the reputation of a turbulent girl. That's what it says. I don't know what that is. Popular opinion among children, as among men, is often just, but as often very unjust, for the same manifestations may proceed from opposite principles, and therefore, as indices to character, may mislead as often as enlighten. Next door to the house in which Elsie resided dwelt a tradesman and his wife, who kept an indefinite sort of shop, in which various kinds of goods were exposed for sale. Their youngest son was about the same age as Elsie, and while they were rather more than children and less than young people, he spent many of his evenings with her, somewhat to the loss of position in his classes at the parish school. They were, indeed, much attached to each other, and peculiarly constituted as Elsie was, one may imagine what kind of heavenly messenger and companion stronger than herself must have been to her. In fact, if she could have framed the undefinable need of her childlike nature into an articulate prayer, it would have been, give me someone to love me stronger than I. Alright, in fact, if she could have framed the undefinable need of her childlike nature into an articulate prayer, it would have been, give me someone to love me stronger than I. Any love was helpful, yes, in its degree, saving to her poor troubled soul, but the hope, as they grew older together, that the powerful yet tender-hearted youth really loved her, and would one day make her his wife, was like the opening of a heavenly eyes of life and love in the hitherto blank and death-like face of her existence. But nothing had been said of love, although they met and parted like lovers. Doubtless, if the circles of their thought and feeling had continued as now to intersect each other, there would have been no interruption of their affection. But the time at length arrived when the old couple, seeing the rest of their family comfortably settled in life, resolved to make a gentleman of the youngest, and so sent him from school to college. The facilities existing in Scotland for providing a professional training enabled them to educate him as a surgeon. He parted from Elsie with some regret, but far less dependent on her than she was on him, and full of the prospects of the future. He felt none of that sinking at the heart which seemed to lay her whole nature open to a fresh inroad of all the terrors and sorrows of her peculiar existence. No correspondence took place between them. New pursuits and relations, and the development of his tastes and judgments entirely altered the position of poor Elsie in his memory, having been, during their intercourse, far less of a man than she of a woman. He had no definite idea of the place he had occupied in her regard, and in his mind she receded into the background of the past, without his having any idea that she would suffer thereby, or that he was unjust towards her, while, in her thoughts, his image stood in the highest and clearest relief. It was the center point from which and towards which all lines radiated and converged, and although she could not but be doubtful of the future, yet there was much hope mingled with her doubts. But when, at the close of 2 years, he visited his native village, and she saw before her, instead of the homely youth who had left her that wintry evening, one who, to her inexperienced eyes, appeared a finished gentleman, her heart sank within her, as if she had found nature herself false in her ripening processes, destroying the beautiful promise of a former year by changing instead of developing her creations. I'm going to repeat that. I don't know. As if she had found nature herself false in her ripening processes, destroying the beautiful promise of a former year by changing instead of developing her creatures. He spoke kindly to her, but not cordially. To her ear, the voice seemed to come from a great distance out of the past, and while she looked upon him, that optical change passed over her vision, which all have experienced after gazing abstractly on any object for a time. His form grew very small and receded to immeasurable distance, till her imagination mingled with the twilight haze of her senses. She seemed to see him standing far off on a hill, with the bright horizon of sunset for a background to his clearly defined figure. She knew no more till she found herself in bed in the dark, and the first message that reached her from the outer world was the infernal growl of the bulldog from the room below. Next day she saw her lover walking with 2 ladies, who would have thought it some degree of condescension to speak to her, and he passed the house without once looking towards it. One who is sufficiently possessed by the demon of nervousness to be glad of the magnificent influences of a friend's company in a public promenade, or of a horse beneath him in passing through a churchyard, will have some faint idea of how utterly exposed and defenseless poor Elsie now felt on the crowded thoroughfare of life. And so the insensibility which had overtaken her was not the ordinary swoon with which nature relieves the overstrained nerves, but the return of the epileptic fits of her early childhood. And if the condition of the poor girl had been pitiable before, it was tenfold more so now. Yet she did not complain, but bore all in silence, though it was evident that her health was giving way. But now help came to her from a strange quarter, though many might not be willing to accord the name of help to that which rather hastened than retarded the progress of her decline. Though many might not be willing to accord the nature of help to that which rather hastened than retarded the progress of her decline, she had gone to spend a few of the summer days with a relative in the country, some miles from her home, if home it could be called. One evening towards sunset she went out for a solitary walk. Passing from the little garden state, she went along a bare country road for some distance, and then turning aside by a footpath through a thicket of low trees, she came out to a lonely little churchyard on the hillside. Hardly knowing whether or not she had intended to go there, she seated herself on a mound covered with long grass. Of one of many, before her stood the ruins of an old church which was taking centuries to crumble. Little remained but the gable wall. Little remained but the gable wall, immensely thick and covered with ancient ivy. The rays of the setting sun fell on a mound at its foot, not green like the rest, but of rich red-brown in the rosy sunset, and evidently but newly heaped up. Her eyes, too, rested upon it. Slowly the sun sank below the near horizon. As the last brilliant point disappeared, the ivy darkened, and the wind arose and shook all its leaves, making them look cold and troubled, and to Elsie's ear came a low faint sound as from a far off bell, but close beside her, and she started and shivered at the sound. Rose a deep, monotonous, almost sepulchral voice. Come hame, the wow. Come hame, the wow. At once she understood the whole. She sat in the churchyard of the ancient parish church of Ruthven, and when she lifted up her eyes, there she saw, in the half-ruined belfry, the old bell, all but hidden with ivy, which the passing wind had roused to utter one sleepy tone. And there, beside her, stood the fool with the bell on his arm, and to him and her the wow o' Riven said, Come hame. Ah, what did she want in the whole universe of God but a home? And though the ground beneath was hard, and the sky overhead far and boundless, and the hillside lonely and companionless, yet somewhere within the visible and beyond these the outer surfaces of creation there might be a home for her. As round the wintry house the snows lie heaped up cold and white and dreary all the long fortnight, while within, beyond the closed shutters, and giving no glimmer through the thick stone walls, the fires are blazing joyously, and the voices and laughter of young unfrozen children are heard, and nothing belongs to winter but the gray hairs on the heads of the parents. Within those warm hearts childlike voices are heard, and childlike thoughts move to and fro. The kernel of winter itself is spring, or a summer, or a sleeping summer. It's a good one. The kernel of winter itself is spring, or a sleeping summer. It was no wonder that the fool, cast out of the earth on a far more desolate spot than this, should seek to return within her bosom at this place of open doors, and should call it home. For surely the surface of the earth had no home for him. The mound at the foot of the gable contained the body of one who had shown him kindness. He had followed the funeral that afternoon from the town, and had remained behind with the bell. Indeed, it was his custom, though Elsie had not known it, to follow every funeral going to this, his favorite churchyard of Ruthven, and possibly in imitation of its booming, for it was still tolled at the funerals. He had given the old bell the name the wow, and had translated its monotonous clangor into the articulate sounds, Come hame. What precise meaning he attached to the words, it is impossible to say, but it was evident that the place possessed a strange attraction for him, drawing him towards it by the cords of some spiritual magnetism. It is possible that in the mind of the idiot there may have been some feeling about this churchyard and bell, which, in the mind of another, would have become a grand poetic thought. I'm going to read that again. It is possible that in the mind of the idiot there may have been some feeling about this churchyard and bell, which, in the mind of another, would have become a grand poetic thought. A feeling as if the ghostly old bell hung at the church door of the invisible world, and never and anon rang out joyous notes, though they sounded sad in the ears of the living, called to the children of the unseen to come home. God, it's so good. A feeling as if a grand poetic thought, a feeling as if the ghostly old bell hung at the church door of the invisible world. It never and anon rang out joyous notes, though they sounded sad in the eyes of the living, calling to the children of the unseen to come home, come home. She sat for some time in silence, for the bell did not ring again, and the fool spoke no more, till the dews began to fall, when she rose and went home, followed by her companion, who passed the night in the barn. From that hour Elsie was furnished with a visual image of the rest she sought, an image which, mingling with deeper and holier thoughts, became, like the bow set in the cloud, the earthly pledge and sign of the fulfillment of heavenly hopes. Often when the wintry fog of cold discomfort and homelessness filled her soul, all at once the picture of the little churchyard, with the old gable and belfry, and the slanting sunlight steeping down to the very roots of the long grass on the graves, arose in the darkened chamber, camera obscura, the darkened chamber of her soul. And again she heard the faint Aeolian sound of the bell, and the voice of the prophet fool, who interpreted the oracle, and the inward weariness was soothed by the promise of a long sleep. Who can tell how many have been counted fools simply because they were prophets, or how much of the madness in the world may be the utterance of the thoughts true and just, but belonging to a region different from ours in this nature and scenery? I feel like I should repeat that one. Gosh, I like the whole thing though. And again she heard the faint Aeolian sound of the bell, and the voice of the prophet fool, who interpreted the oracle, and the inward weariness was soothed by the promise of a long sleep. Who can tell how many have been counted fools simply because they were prophets, or how much of the madness in the world may be the utterance of thoughts true and just, but belonging to a region differing from ours in its nature and scenery? But to Elsie, looking out of her window, came the mocking tones of the idle boys who had chosen as the vehicle of their scorn the very words which showed the relation of the fool to the eternal, and revealed in him an element higher far than any yet developed in them. I'm going to read that again because I just missed that. Sorry. But to Elsie, looking out of her window, came the mocking tones of the idle boys who had chosen as the vehicle of their scorn the very words which showed the relation of the fool to the eternal, and revealed in him an element higher far than any yet developed in them. I'm going to have to think on that for a while. They turned his glory into shame, like the enemies of David when they mocked the would-be king. And the best in a man is often that which is most condemned by those who have not attained to his goodness. I'm going to read that again. And the best in a man is often that which is most condemned by those who have not attained to his goodness. The words, however, even as repeated by the boys, had not solely awakened indignation at the persecution of the old man. They had likewise comforted her with the thought of the refuge that awaited both him and her. But the same evening a worse trial was in store for her. Again she sat near the window, oppressed by the consciousness that her brother had come in. He had gone upstairs, and his dog had remained at the door, exchanging surly compliments with some of his own kind, when the fool came strolling past, and, I do not know from what cause, the dog flew at him. Elsie heard his cry and looked up. Her fear of the brute vanished in a moment before her sympathy for her friend. She darted from the house and rushed towards the dog to drag him off the defenseless idiot, calling him by his name in a tone of anger and dislike. He left the fool, and springing at Elsie, seized her by the arm above the elbow with such a grip that, in the midst of her agony, she fancied she heard the bone crack. But she uttered no cry, for the most apprehensive are sometimes the most courageous. Just then, however, her former lover was coming along the street, and catching a glimpse of what had happened, was on the spot in an instant, took the dog by the throat with a grip not inferior to his own, and having thus compelled him to relax his hold, dashed him on the ground with a force that almost stunned him, and then with a superadded kick sent him away limping and howling, whereupon the fool, attacking him furiously with a stick, would certainly have finished him, had not his master descried his plight and come to his rescue. Meantime, the young surgeon had carried Elsie into the house, for as soon as she was rescued from the dog, she had fallen down in one of her fits, which were becoming more and more frequent of themselves, and little needed such a shock as this to increase their violence. He was dressing her arm when she began to recover, and when she opened her eyes, in a state of half-consciousness, the first object she beheld was his face bending over her. Recalling nothing of what had occurred, it seemed to her, in the dreamy condition in which the fit had left her, the same face, unchanged, which had once shone in upon her tardy springtime, and promised to ripen it into summer. She forgot it had departed and left her in the wintry cold. And so she uttered wild words of love and trust in the youth, while, stung with remorse at his own neglect, was astonished to perceive the poetic forms of beauty in which the soul of the uneducated maiden burst into flower. But as her senses recovered themselves, the face gradually changed to her, as if the slow alteration of 2 years had become phantasmagorically compressed into a few moments. What a word. And the glow departed from the maiden's thoughts and words, and her soul found itself at the narrow window of the present, from which she could behold but a dreary country. From the street came the iambic cry of the fool, "Come hame, come hame." I don't know how to say this name. Tycho Brahe? I don't know. I think is said to have kept a fool, who frequently sat at his feet in his study, and to whose mutterings he used to listen in the pauses of his own thought. The shining soul of the astronomer drew forth the rainbow of harmony from the misty spray of words, ascending ever from the dark gulf into which the thoughts of the idiot were ever falling. He beheld curious concurrences of words therein, and could read strange meanings from them, sometimes even received wondrous hints for the direction of celestial inquiry, from what, to any other, and it may be to the fool himself, was but a ceaseless and aimless babble. Such power lieth in words. Good Lord, that's so freaking good. So the guy's name, he puts a note, it's Tycho Brahe, I don't know, Tycho, it's Tycho Brahe, if anyone wants to look that up. Is said to have kept a fool, who frequently sat at his feet in his study, and to whose mutterings he used to listen in the pauses of his own thought. The shining soul of the astronomer drew forth the rainbow of harmony from the misty spray of words, ascending ever from the dark gulf into which the thoughts of the idiot were ever falling. He beheld curious concurrences of words therein, and could read strange meanings from them, sometimes even received wondrous hints for the direction of celestial inquiry, from what, to any other, and it may be even to the fool himself, was but a ceaseless and aimless babble. Such power lieth in words. It is not then to be wondered at that the sounds I have mentioned should fall on the ears of Elsie at such a moment as a message from God himself. Then all this dreariness, was but a passing show like the rest. And there lay somewhere for her a reality, a home. The tears burst up from her oppressed heart. She received the message and prepared to go home. From that time her strength gradually sank, but her spirits as steadily rose. The strength of the fool, too, began to fail, for he was old. He bore all the signs of age, even to the gray hairs, which betokened no wisdom. But one cannot say what wisdom might be in him, or how far he had not fought his own battle and been victorious. Whether any notion of a continuance of life and thought dwelt in his brain, it is impossible to tell, but he seemed to have the idea that this was not his home, and those who saw him gradually approaching his end might well anticipate for him a higher life in the world to come. He had passed through this world without ever awakening to such a consciousness of being as is common to mankind. He had spent his years like a weary dream through a long night, a strange, dismal, unkindly dream, and now the morning was at hand. Often in his dream had he listened with sleepy senses to the ringing of the bell, but that bell would awake him at last. He was like a seed buried too deep in the soil, to which the light has never penetrated, and which, therefore, has never forced its way upwards to the open air, never experienced the resurrection of the dead. But seeds will grow ages after they have fallen into the earth, and indeed, with many kinds, and within some limits, the older the seed before it germinates, the more plentiful the fruit. And may it not be believed of many human beings that, the great husbandman having sown them like seeds in the soil of human affairs, there they lie buried a life long, and only after the upturning of the soil by death, reach a position in which the awakening of their aspiration and the consequent growth become possible. Surely he has made nothing in vain. A violent cold and cough brought him at last near to his end, and hearing that he was ill, Elsie ventured one bright spring day to go see him. When she entered the miserable room where he lay, he held out his hand to her with something like a smile, and muttered feebly and painfully, "I'm gaen to the wow, nay to come back again." Elsie could not restrain her tears, while the old man, looking fixedly at her, though with meaningless eyes, muttered for the last time, come hame, and sank into the lethargy, from which nothing could rouse him, till, next morning, he was waked by friendly death from the long sleep of his world's night. They bore him to his favorite churchyard, and buried him within the sight of the old church, below his loved bell, which had ever been to him as the cuckoo note of a coming spring. Thus he at length obeyed its summons and went home. Elsie lingered till the first summer days lay warm on the land. Several kind hearts in the village, hearing of her illness, visited her and ministered to her, wondering at her sweetness and patience. They regretted they had not known her before. How much consolation might not their kindness have imparted, and how much might not their sympathy have strengthened her on her painful road? But they could not long have delayed her going home, nor, mentally constituted as she was, would this have been at all to be desired. Indeed, it was chiefly the expectation of departure that quieted and soothed her tremulous nature. It was true that a deep spring of hope and faith kept singing on in her heart, but this alone, without the anticipation of speedy release, could only have kept her mind at peace. It could not have reached, at least for a long time, the borderland between body and mind in which her disease lay. One still night of summer, the nurse who watched by her bedside heard her murmur through her sleep, "I hear it, come hame, I'm coming, I'm gaen hame to the wow, nay to come back." She awoke at the sound of her own words, and begged the nurse to convey to her brother her last request, that she might be buried by the side of the fool within the old church of Riven. Then she turned her face to the wall, and in the morning was found quiet and cold. She must have died within a few minutes after her last words. She was buried according to her request, and thus she too went home. Side by side rest the aged fool and the young maiden, for the bell called them and they obeyed. And surely they found the fire burning bright, and heard friendly voices, and felt sweet lips on theirs, in the home to which they went. Surely both intellect and love were waiting them there. Still the old bell hangs in the old gable, and when ever another is borne to the old churchyard, it keeps calling to those who are left behind with the same sad but friendly and unchanging voice, come hame, come hame, come hame. Then it ends with this scripture. Thy sun shall no more go down, neither shall thy moon withdraw itself, for the Lord shall be thine everlasting light, and the days of thy mourning shall be ended. Isaiah, what is that? Gosh, freaking Roman numerals. Isaiah LX verse 20, whatever. I don't even remember what that is. All right, that's the story. So hopefully, I'm sorry about my reading. I know it's just like I read and it's monotone and it's cumbersome and I don't pronounce words right, but hopefully people will listen. Hopefully people will read. It's hard to get people to read things, and understandably so, because things have to come at the right time. Luckily, George MacDonald's, all his stuff, I think, came at the right time for me, but he still sits like that seed, just germinating in the ground, waiting for people to find him. But like I said, I think people just don't touch his work because it's not the right time. But hopefully people will get into it, because it is just, gosh, so much good stuff. A lot of it is not always the easiest thing to read, though. And a lot of it calls for pause and thought and like hours of thought. Sometimes you read a sentence and you're like, wow, I'm gonna have to think about that for 5 days or so. So yeah, but it's good stuff.